Okay, so let me give you an example of when a theory had to be modified because additional data showed that the original theory um, had been disproven. So, if you've taken social psychology, you're probably familiar with the fundamental attribution error. This theory suggests that people make um, dispositional explanations for other people's behavior, but situational explanations for their own behavior. So, for example, if you and I both um, failed an exam, I would say, "Oh, I failed because I couldn't sleep the night before, or my girlfriend dumped me." But you failed because you're just not that smart. So I have situational explanations for my own behavior, but your behavior is really just due to the fact that you aren't that smart. So I'm really smart enough, but the situation kind of prevented me from doing as well as I should have. But for you, you didn't do well just because you weren't that smart. And back in the 60s and the 70s, it was a widely accepted theory to the point where they called it fundamental, like everybody does this, right? But the problem was that in the 80s, when people started doing more cultural research, they found that in like Eastern cultures, they tended to do the exact opposite, right? So they made dispositional explanations for their own behavior, but situational explanations for other people's behavior. So I failed because I'm not that smart, but you probably failed because, maybe you didn't get enough sleep or your girlfriend dumped you, right? So as a result, they had to modify the theory to factor in these results that disconfirmed the initial theory. So then they had to now modify it to fit this new data. So what I want you to recognize is that when you have ultimately get data that disconfirms your original theory, either you have to discard that theory or you can modify it. And oftentimes people will find ways to modify it to factor in the reasons why um, you failed to get the consistent results that you got in the beginning. And for this one, they're arguing it's a cultural effect where certain cultures just have different views towards these attributions than other cultures. All right, so let's talk about one more theory, the theory that I'm making up, and then I'll wrap up the lecture for today. But I want to make one important point with this particular theory. I'm going to call it the theory of door knocking. All right, so if you've ever watched either the TV show Psych or The Mentalist, those are shows about people who are pretending to be psychics, but in reality they're not. Um, in contrast, I'm going to argue right now that I am an actual psychic and I just started getting in touch with my psychic abilities. And what I want us to do is to take my psychic ability and your money and go to Vegas and get rich, right? Um, so obviously you're going to start to question whether or not I really have psychic ability. And I'm like, okay, it's still pretty new and I haven't quite figured out all the nuances of it. But there's one thing I'm very good at now based upon my psychic ability is that I can tell you about someone just from hearing them knock on a door. All right, so imagine we're on campus and you take me to a room. You pick the room, you take me to a room, and we make sure that there's no windows in the room and we close the door, right? And then you get to pick three people to come and knock on the door. All right. Now remember, you're picking the people. You pick the room. This is not some kind of Ocean's 11. I'm trying to do some kind of heist again and take all your money. This is me legitimately saying I have psychic ability, and this is you saying, all right, I want you to test. I want to test your psychic ability by putting you in a room on campus, and you pick the room. You pick who knocks on the door. Okay. All right. So we're gonna do this three times. So the first knock, um, you get a knock on the door, and I kind of get into the zone and I think about it, and I say the person that's knocking is a female. Okay, we open the door, and it's a female. Are you convinced now, based upon this evidence, that I am a psychic? And inevitably, everyone says no. They're like, no, it's not a psychic because of that. It's a pretty good chance the person's going to be a female. There's more females on campus than males, so the odds are in your favor. Fair enough. So then we wait, and then you have the second person knock on the door. And I say the person knocking is a male student who's under 22 years old. We open the door, it's a male, and we ask him how old he is. He says he's 19. All right, so now, do you think that I'm psychic? And inevitably, most people will say no, because it's still pretty likely to be able to find a male who's under 22. Now, I would give a pushback and say it's not as likely as you think. There may be, like, I don't know, 25% chance of getting a male under 22 on campus. So it's not like it's the odds are in my favor, but it's still something that's likely enough to happen. It's not unreasonable to think that I can find a male student under 22. All right. So then you have a third person come to the door and they knock, and this time I'm really focused. And I'm like, all right, this third person, it's a 30-year-old woman. She's 5'11". She's holding a green apple in her right hand and knocking on the door with her left hand. We open the door. Lo and behold, it's a woman. She's 5'11". We ask her age. She's 30 years old. She's holding a green apple in her right hand and knocking on the door with her left hand. Inevitably, half the people in the class would say, "No, I don't believe you. Still, I think you're full of it. You're not psychic. Somehow this is a trick." But hopefully, a few of you would recognize that the odds of me being able to be this specific and still be correct is very unlikely, right? So there aren't that many people on campus who are exactly 30 years old. The majority of women are not 5'11". It's a very small percentage of women who are actually 5'11", right? Um, a green apple is not that common of a fruit to have. And people tend to knock with their dominant hand, so most likely she's left-handed. And left-handed people are less common than right-handed people. So the odds of me of being able to get all of this correct are probably like 1 in like 10 million, right? It's very unlikely. You have a better chance of winning the lottery than me getting all these correct. And as a result, I would argue that you should feel as though I have some kind of abilities because I was able to be so specific and still be correct. And you'd be right in thinking that the first two examples, they don't really give that much evidence that I'm psychic because the odds are really in my favor. This particular example, the odds are not at all in my favor. But yet and still, I was able to correctly tell you information about this person. And as a result, because the odds are not in my favor, it's such an unlikely scenario to get correct, and I got it correct, you should feel much more confident now that I am psychic. And you should invest your money with me, and we should be heading to Vegas. So the argument here is that the third knock should have been the most convincing because of its specificity. I was very specific about who was knocking, whereas the other two examples I was pretty general. And that specificity then opens me up to being incorrect, right? And the probability of me being correct was so low that if I got it right, you should feel as though I have some kind of ability. So what's happening is my third example is one in which I'm opening up myself to being disconfirmed. And the chances of being disconfirmed are greater than the chance of me actually providing evidence that would confirm that I have psychic ability. And because the chances are that I should be disconfirmed and I wasn't, should be compelling to tell you that I have some kind of psychic ability. The same thing goes for theories. You want to have a theory that's specific and has hypotheses that will expose themselves to a high probability of being falsified. And the idea is that because there's a good chance of it being falsified, if the data still supports the hypothesis, that provides strong evidence for that hypothesis, that it's correct, right? It doesn't say definitively that it's correct, but it gives pretty strong evidence that you have a theory that's actually correct. Bad theories are very general and are very hard to be disconfirmed. So like if I had said the person knocking on the door is less than 100 years old, it's very hard to find someone who's going to be on campus who's over 100 years old. So it's very unlikely that my prediction will be disconfirmed. So it's a bad prediction. In similar ways, bad theories are so general that no matter what happens, you're probably going to get evidence in support of that particular theory. And that's why Freudian theories have kind of fallen out of favor, because they were so general, it was almost impossible to disconfirm them. He could always find a way to explain them, and it was very hard to disconfirm them. And as a result, people don't really put much emphasis on Freudian theories anymore. So, some take-home points. Psychologists have a lot of theories. From these theories, they develop hypotheses, and they use these hypotheses to collect data to then test the theory. If the data supports the hypothesis, it therefore in turn supports the theory from which the hypothesis was derived. I want you also to remember that good theories make clear hypotheses that have yet to be disconfirmed.